Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of The Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at The Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all social media. On this week's episode, we are joined by Marc Schindler of Georgetown's Center for Youth Justice to discuss the Forgotten Children's Initiative that he is leading there. We have discussed several times on this podcast the recent efforts in both Canada and the United States to identify and recognize the children who died and were buried at Indian boarding schools during that dark period of American history, when Indigenous kids were routinely taken from their families and placed in such schools to be assimilated by white and often Christian society. There is also a growing body of evidence that the same sort of indifference took place at some of America's early juvenile justice institutions. Perhaps the most well-known history now is of Florida's Dozier School, which was the basis for the recent work of fiction Nickel Boys, which is actually both a book and a film. The Imprint's Michael Fitzgerald wrote in 2024 about another gravesite discovered in New York State at a correctional facility for girls. I'll drop a link to that great article in our show notes. Schindler joined us to discuss how, during his time helping to lead Maryland's Juvenile Justice Agency, they began to research the history of a place known as the Maryland House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored Children, which was based in Cheltenham, Maryland, and existed from 1877 to 1939. And that research led to the discovery of an unmarked graveyard with the remains of more than 300 children who were buried unceremoniously and, it seems, often with no notice to their families. So we discussed that important but heartbreaking work and how Schindler sees this ongoing research project in the context of current discussions around reforming the juvenile justice system in Maryland and elsewhere. I'll make sure to include a link in the show notes to an op-ed from Schindler and his colleague Vinny Schiraldi, along with some other coverage of the Forgotten Children's Initiative and more. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Marc Schindler. All right, we are joined today by Marc Schindler, Center for Youth Justice at Georgetown. He has helped lead DC's youth justice system, Maryland's youth justice system. In between there, he led the Justice Policy Institute, and he joins us to talk about the Forgotten Children's Initiative, an effort to identify and honor the lives of hundreds of children who were buried at the Maryland House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored Children between 1877 and 1939. Marc, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks for having me, John. Great to be with you.
And because we get into very serious and often tragic stories like this all the time on this podcast, we like to start light and get the listeners to know a little bit about the guests. So Marc has to give us at least one recommendation or favorite in these categories. He can give us more if he wants. Marc, here's what you got to pick from: movie or TV show, book, musical group, or sports team. Like I said, you can just give me one. You can give me all five, whatever you want, but give the folks something you're liking or that's your favorite in one of those.
I'll give you two, John. So
nice. Okay.
You caught me a little off guard there, but I'm thinking, so I've been in DC now. I'm originally from New York, but I've been in DC after Baltimore for almost 30 years. And I'm pining for one of my favorite TV shows is West Wing, which was from a long time ago, but I've recently been reacclimated with it through my college age kids, particularly my daughter, who likely became a West Wing fan. And so one of the best shows of all time, great, cool actors. And for whatever reason, I'm really pining for President Bartlett these days.
I think you're probably not the only person that nostalgically binge watches West Wing. I think I know a few people that do that. You got a favorite West Winger going subterranean on your pick?
Oh, gosh.
I feel like
can't pick.
Josh Lyman's like the
Yeah,
go-to. Like a lot of people
Lyman,
like him.
Josh Lyman, President Bartlett, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, there was a bunch. The Anna Devere Smith character.
Oh, she was so good. I can't remember her name right now, but she was the CIA director, I think, or NSA, one of the two.
Maybe NSA, I can't
Yeah,
remember.
she was amazing. And I'm also not blanking. I'm blanking on the character name that Marlee Matlin played, the deaf political advisor and pollster. She was amazing. There were just so many people that were good in that.
So many people.
Yeah.
And then I'll go to sports team.
Okay.
If you give me another couple seconds on this. I'm sure you know what I'm going to say. Leeds United.
I did not see that coming. I thought you were going to just say Georgetown and be a good company man.
Oh, I probably should say that. I do plays, even though I'm a St. John's guy for hoops. But no, Leeds United got promoted from the championship division last year into Premier League. Fighting that battle, has some history of Americans on that team. Currently has an American doing quite well. And they're just scrappy. And so I'm following Leeds United.
West Wing and Leeds United. There you go, people. Okay, so as I said in the tee up here, the facility in question was once called the Maryland House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored Children. That existed between 1877 and 1939, so just post-Civil War era in our history. But can you give the folks like a little bit of history just around that place, Cheltenham, and its presence in the juvenile and youth justice systems over time? Because that was the first of what would become different places, right?
Yeah, I can give the historical facts. I can also give a little bit of, if you're interested, how I came to know
Please.
about.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So this goes back probably about 25 years-ish, when a number of folks here in the Washington area, otherwise known as the DMV, were doing advocacy around conditions in youth facilities in Maryland. That includes, at the time, I was working with people like Marc Schindler of the Youth Law Center, Vinnie Schiraldi, who at the time was heading up the Justice Policy Institute, Michael Umpierre, who was working with us at the Youth Law Center, and Joe Scantlebury, and Liz Ryan as well, who we were all working along with some really terrific Maryland advocates like Maceo Holman and others. And we were doing advocacy around conditions at Cheltenham. And we had just, I think, we did a lot of advocacy around, you may remember the Tallulah facility in Louisiana. And we worked on a Close Tallulah campaign. I actually can't remember the sequence now, whether Close Tallulah came first or Close Cheltenham came first. But we were doing advocacy around the facilities in Maryland. The Youth Law Center, where I was, had done an assessment of the conditions at Cheltenham. And that report, that was authored primarily by Marc Schindler, called it one of the worst facilities in the country. And so we were trying to get it closed. And there was a Close Cheltenham Now campaign. And as we were doing that, I remember that we learned at some point that facility, the predecessor to that facility, had been called the House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored Children, like way back in the day. And I think we noted that a bit in our advocacy, but I don't remember in great detail. Then fast forward about 25-ish years, and Vinnie Schiraldi and I are back at DJS, or not back at DJS. All of a sudden, we're running DJS, the Department of Juvenile Services in Maryland.
Yeah, and I think we should point out at this point, the Close Cheltenham was unsuccessful. It's still a facility now.
Still a facility.
So that's now correct. You guys are running a system that includes this place.
Exactly. Okay. That's a good, very good point. Yeah. Yes, we were not successful in that campaign. I think it had good impact in some ways, but yeah, the facility continued to run. Yeah. Although they did close. The facility at Cheltenham that we were advocating about did close in, I think, 2016 or so. But they built a new, shiny, still called Cheltenham Youth Detention Center.
Got it.
Which was better, but not by much. When Vinny and I got to DJS in 2023, I said to him, I was like, hey, Ben, do you remember what the facility out Cheltenham was called back in the day? And he said, I won't use the expletive, but he said, yeah, I remember the House of Reformation for colored children, right?
Yeah.
And I said, yeah. And I said, I think we should do something. I think we should research that. I think we should find out more. There was just a mention on the website, but there really wasn't much information about it. And I said, Vinny, I think we should research it and start to find out like what exactly was the history and that we should share it, right? Because we both felt and believe that if you're trying to change something, you got to understand where you're coming from, right? And so Vinny said to me, he said, yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. You can lead that, Mark. But he said, I got about 100 other things I need you to lead. And that can't be number one. And I'm not sure how close to the top that could be because we got so much stuff to do.
Yeah.
But he said, absolutely, we should do it. And you lead it. Let's figure it out. So I walked out of his office like I have a lot of times over the years after meeting with Vinny and go, okay, like, we got a lot of stuff to do. How do we do it? And so, quite frankly, we got lucky. And I don't know, a couple of weeks later, I got an email that went out to all of the chiefs of staff across Maryland state government. And it was one of these emails where it said, hey, chiefs of staffs, there's a program. It's called Govern for America, which I had never heard of. And there are fellows that are Govern for America fellows, GFA. Everybody's heard of TFA, Teach for America. I'd never heard of GFA, but it's basically like TFA. I don't know how long it's been around for, but it's for recent college graduates who have an interest in going into government, public service, and they can get a fellowship at a state agency, maybe federal too, I don't know. And we're like nonprofit people, right? So if somebody says, do you want a fellow or an intern? You're right. Yeah, absolutely. Like free labor? Sure. Turns out it wasn't free. We actually had to pay for it, but we had a budget of $300 million, so we could find some money. And so I said, sure, we'd love to have a fellow. And then people start applying because you list your agency and here's the job, which was legislative and policy analyst. And so we got a bunch of people applying and we got lucky because the person who we ultimately hired, Crystal Ferretia, who was a recent graduate of Columbia University and a history major. And she actually knew a bit about the juvenile justice system in Maryland because as a high school student in Silver Spring, she had been, I think, the student or youth rep on the Juvenile Justice Advisory Board. And so she knew a bit. And so she was a great candidate, fantastic. And so we decided to hire her. But in the interview, I said to her, I said, so we've got this, I'm interested in doing some research about the history of our agency, one facility in particular. And I described to her what I just described to you, what I knew about it. Here's the name of the facility. I didn't know much more. And I said, would you be interested in doing that type of project? And she was like, oh, I would love to do that. That would be fantastic. I said, great. At the bottom of your job description, the last line is going to say other duties as assigned.
That's going to be it.
This is going to be your, for the rest of your job, you're going to report to another person doing legislative and policy. But for this, you'll report to me and we'll work together on it. And she said, great. She started and she was just off to the races and started to find all sorts of very interesting history that we didn't know about, which I'm happy to go into with you if you want. But that's how it sort of started.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's get into that because if you just search the name of the old facility, what comes up on the internet is first that it was created to keep Black kids out of adult jail, which just in that very small sliver of its history is probably a virtuous purpose, right? But then I'm sure Crystal led finding out what life was like there for the kids. And yeah, I think it would be interesting for people to hear. What was a day like for a young person who was housed there?
So if you do that search, that's what one of the first things. You see a lot more now because now we've put out a lot more information. But yeah, she did. That was one of the things that she's reported in her earlier research, which I didn't know, that in 1870, the Maryland General Assembly had established the House of Reformation and Instruction for Colored children specifically to remove children from adult jails and prisons. But what we didn't know, and you wouldn't get on that first search, but what Crystal research showed is that facility followed, depending on how you're counting, by 20 or 40 years. And this gets to your question of where this fits into the history of juvenile justice a little bit more broadly. So starting in roughly the 1820-ish, there were people mostly in the northeastern United States, Massachusetts, New York, particularly Connecticut, Pennsylvania, who were the early do-gooder, child saver types. And there started a movement to treat children who came into contact with the law in some way better, specifically to take them out of adult jails and prisons. So remember, this is the early 1800s. The juvenile court is not founded until 1899, right? So when kids got in trouble with law, they just went into this big, dysfunctional, pretty horrific system. This is also still obviously why slavery was still very much in existence in this country. And so the early facilities to remove kids from the adult system were often known as houses of refuge. I think the first one was either, New York or Massachusetts, and then they started to spread. Maryland established the Maryland House of Refuge by law in 1830. And it was the first Southern state to establish a house of refuge. And the General Assembly acted and said, children should not be in adult jails and prisons. We should have a separate facility for them. It took them 20 years to actually fund or appropriate for the establishment of the House of Refuge. And so by 1850, there was an appropriation. Those early houses of refuge and the House of Reformation in Maryland initially were privately run for the most part, but funded by the state. So it was a little sort of quasi-state private. And so they didn't fund the House of Refuge in Maryland until 1850, and it opened a few years later. I think in 1853 or 1855. When it opened, they had roughly 200 children who were removed from adult jails and prisons and went to the House of Refuge. But it wasn't all the children. It was just the white children. So the black children remained in adult jails and prisons in Maryland, and this was true in some other states as well. But in Maryland, they remained until 20 years later, in 1870, 6 years after slavery was abolished in Maryland, that they decided, we guess we should move the black kids as well.
Right.
So that led to the establishment of the House of Reformation. We had documentation that shows that children were moved as young as 5 years old who had been in an adult jail. The land that the House of Reformation sat on was purchased by a well-known white philanthropist and businessman in Baltimore named Enoch Pratt. Anybody who's familiar with sort of Maryland, particularly Baltimore, knows the name Enoch Pratt because that's the name of the main library. Enoch Pratt had purchased that land out in Prince George's County from the Bowie family, which people know Bowie, Maryland. And that property prior to Enoch Pratt's purchase from the Bowie family was known as the Bowieville Plantation. And that was a plantation with enslaved people. Pratt purchases the land and donates it to the state to create the House of Reformation for colored children. And I give that background and that context, which is the research that we were uncovering, to also start to explain that the conditions and the way the House of Reformation for colored children existed, I don't believe, based on the research that we've done, was much different than how that place operated as the Bowieville Plantation, right? The facility for white children was known as the House of Refuge, and the focus in the establishment language and in the early mission was about education, rehabilitation, caring for children. The facility for the black children was the House of Reformation. refuge for white children, reformation for black children. And the mission language talked about training the children there to be able to work in fields, to be able to do labor, right? Essentially, to work as slaves in some ways. And remember, this was 1870, right? The children who were at the House of Reformation in the early days, likely, we're doing this research now, their parents were likely enslaved people. Some of the children may have been enslaved people, right? If they were older than, right, 6 years old, which they were, most of them. And so, based on our research, it appears that facility was run like a plantation. The children did not go to school. They were leased out to area farms. We know that in some ways as convict leasing. They were sometimes referred to as apprenticeships, but what that meant is they were sent to the homes and farms of white landowners in the area to work. And they weren't paid. The money, if there was money exchanged, went back to the state or to the facility to help run the facility.
And was this done in tandem with any attempt at what you might consider to be education, academic regimen of any kind? Or
the most minimal. Now, I think we should understand this is not to defend, and I think the conditions were horrific, right? And we're now uncovering that, and now we know at least 230 boys over a period of years never made it home from the House of Reformation and are buried on that property. And we can talk more about that, and that's what led to this initiative. But I will say there at least was good intent. The facility was created to remove children from adult jails and prisons. As bad as the conditions were in the House of Reformation, I have no doubt that the conditions for children in Maryland's adult jails and prisons were even worse. And we have found now through our research that, like the situation with children having died and buried near the House of Reformation, we also know that there were children who died or were killed and are buried next to the old House of Corrections, which was the adult state penitentiary at the time, right? When children were still being sent to the adult facilities.
Yeah.
So while the House of Reformation, I think, was not a good place for children by any means, it is relative to what also was going on with children being sent to adult jails and prisons. And I think that people like Enoch Pratt were well-intentioned, right? I think that they were trying to create a place that would be better for children than the situation that existed before. But I also believe that they viewed Black children much differently than they viewed white children up at the House of Refuge. And I think that played out in how we know the facility operated and ultimately the incredibly tragic circumstances of children dying or being killed in significant numbers at that facility.
To the best of our knowledge through your guys' deep research here, a day in the life of a young man who would have been at the House of Reformation was you woke up, you probably got fed at the beginning and the end of the day, and in between you were transported to somebody else's farm to work.
Or yes, so that's correct. And you may have stayed at the farm, not right.
Yeah.
So that I think it varied, and we're still researching this.
Okay.
But a lot of the kids, I think most of the kids were not sent out. There were kids, and there were kids who were sent out upon release, finishing their term at the House of Reformation, and that their placement was with a white family to work.
So when they finished their time at the Reformation, often even then they would not go home. They would be placed with a family.
Yeah, that's correct. I don't know the numbers yet on that, and we're still looking at that. But
That they were free to leave and go home on their own, or were they? So they were sentenced to this family.
correct.
Okay,
Yeah, that was their parole.
I
Right?
see.
The person
Yeah,
who arranged the placement was referred to, depending on the documents you look at, either
yeah,
as a parole agent or just as an agent, right? Remember, this is not long after slavery was established. This is, I believe, a form of human trafficking, right? Those children were trafficked, right? They were part of a transaction, right? And somebody was getting labor out of that. But I do think there were also many children who didn't leave the facility during the day. And their typical day, as you were describing, was up early, get some food, I'm sure not very good and probably not enough. But they did not go to school by and large during the day. They had a little bit of schooling, but not much. But they had other things going on, like a broom factory, right? So there was work that they were doing on campus to do two things. One is to essentially help the facility operate internally, doing chores and work, right? Remember, this is the 1800s, but there were jobs, right? And so, example, the broom factory, and I think the purpose of those was to generate revenue to enable the facility to continue to operate, right? So the
yeah.
kids were doing work to sell brooms, for example, so that the facility would have revenue coming in that they can then use to buy the food and
Yeah.
uniforms and upkeep of the facility.
So without going into the minutia of every bucket, I'm sure I guess I'm curious, like, what avenues of research and documentation have bore fruit for you guys? Like, where have you and Crystal been able to actually access things that really illuminated all this?
Yeah, and so the research that we did while at the department, until I and Crystal and a few others left in July, which was largely led by Crystal with others of us participating. The sources of that information were largely archival information that was online, some research, academic studies that had been done over time, right, by various academics that is cited in the research that we were doing, as well as we followed up on that since I left the department to look at archival research in the Maryland State Archives, which is one of the better state archives as I now understand it, to look at the actual physical copies of documentation that was created at the time. That we didn't look at that while we were at the department for the most part. Crystal and others were relying on what was online. But since then, I've looked at and others have now looked at probably the best source of information, in addition to what Crystal researched, was the annual reports submitted by the House of Reformation superintendent to the governor each year, starting in the 1870s. And then there are reports that go through the 1930s and 40s. We're still looking at these. At one point, I don't recall the year, they started doing biannual reports. So they were every 2 years. Those reports are very informative and give a picture of what was going on at the time. And I think importantly, how the children were viewed at the House of Reformation. We're also starting to do the research here at Georgetown to look at the documentation for the House of Refuge. We did some of that. Crystal did some of that at the department, and we'll be going deeper into that to start to look at the documentation in terms of how the two facilities operated differently. We know from the research that was already done, for example, that the House of Refuge, for roughly the same number of children, had twice the budget than the House of Reformation. Not surprising.
No.
But the annual reports that we've looked at the Maryland State Archives have been very informative in terms of both the daily existence of the children there, as well as, sadly, the mortality and deaths that existed or that occurred. And we can talk more about that in terms of what we found.
Yeah, of course. Let's get to that because that is at the crux of what this initiative is going to be about, is these young people who died on the campus. So as far as that goes, I want to set a baseline in modern history and then work backwards to this. So you have been involved in leadership at two systems now of a lot more. Have you ever experienced a young person dying at one of DC's facilities or one of Maryland's?
Sadly and tragically, yes. You're bringing lots of memories back to me right now as I'm sitting here.
Yeah, I don't not necessarily need to dwell on those. My question was really going to be, what is the modern policy for how you deal with it when a young person dies in your custody?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's been a whole field that's now grown in recent years about deaths in custody. There are many more deaths in custody, depending on how you define that, in adult carceral settings, partly because of the numbers, right?
Yeah.
But also they are more violent and dangerous places by and large than facilities for children. And that field also includes, as folks know, deaths in the custody of law enforcement or caused by law enforcement, which of course has gotten, appropriately so, an enormous amount of attention in recent years, although probably not as much attention as it should get. And we had, in the 5 years I was helping to lead DC system, right at the beginning, shortly after we took over in DC, we had a child die at the Oak Hill facility. This was in November 2005. We had started at the beginning of 2005, and there was a bad assault on one of the units, which is not uncommon. But tragically, in that situation, the child who was attacked, who was assaulted, fought back and in defensive action managed to get his arms around the child who assaulted him, pushed him back, and that his head hit the windowsill, if you will, and he died a few days later. I don't remember specifically. We all did what we thought was best, right? And I know Vinny and I and a few others, we almost lived at the facility for a couple of days while we were trying to conduct the investigation of what happened, what was done incorrectly, and what we could change. There was a fatality review board, and that's typical in states. And so that type of incident, whether it happens in a facility or in the community, goes before the fatality review board. The fatality review board, I think generally, you may know this better than me, but generally I think tends to review cases more that are in the child welfare system than in the juvenile justice system. And there are protocols around that.
That's what I was trying to get at, is because I do know that is true. I think there's fatality review boards for pretty much every child welfare system. They're of varying degrees of quality. But what the word you just said, protocol, a child dies. What is the protocol? What happens next? Who are you notifying when, and how's that all go? I think in what we're about to talk about, what used to happen at this place, right, it'd be good for listeners to know like what the modern standard
so that's the modern protocol, right? There is a review board. There are protocols about notifying family members up through the chain of government, right? So there are a lot of steps that are supposed to take place, and I think generally do take place.
Yeah.
I think what was happening back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, not only does it appear, and we're still doing the research, not only does it appear there were not protocols, but it appears that many of these deaths were hidden. People were not informed.
Intentionally. You feel from the research intentionally.
Absolutely intentionally. The closest situation to what we're seeing now in Maryland over the last year or so since we discovered it in the field is what a lot of people are familiar with in Florida at the Charles Dozier School that uncovered, where there were deaths and burials uncovered some years ago. A lot of people don't know that story by the name of the Charles Dozier School. More people know it by the fictional book and
The White
film,
House.
The Nickel Boys.
Yeah.
The Nickel Boys, where a lot of the bad things happen at what was referred to as the White House. But the very well done book and film, The Nickel Boys, is the fictional account of what happened at the Charles Dozier School. And similar, there's one instance or story that stands out in my mind from the Dozier School, might have been in Nickel Boys, I can't remember, where a family of one of the children had come to visit their child, and they had been told that their child had run away. And remember, these facilities, they didn't have big fences or things like that. Kids did run
Plausible,
away.
right?
Yeah, and probably for lots of good reasons that they ran away. When we were doing the research, it was discovered around the House of Reformation that there was an instance that was covered. So I should add to, you asked about where the research and the documentation existed. And so I talked about the online archives. I talked about the physical archives. What I didn't mention, I should have mentioned, is the press reporting at the time. So there's a acclaimed news organization called the Afro in Maryland, the Baltimore, Maryland Afro, one of the early Black newspapers. There were a couple of others in Maryland, but the Afro most prominently covered what was going on with kids in the legal system back in the day. And the great thing about the Afro particularly is they have an archive, an online archive of their reporting going back over 100 years. And that has turned out to be an extraordinary resource for information about what happened at the House of Reformation. Particularly, I like to say, because the Afro, which is still in existence today and is covering this story about the House of Reformation, that they are both covering the story and they are part of the story, because the existence of their reporting 150 years ago and the fact that it's digitally archived is part of the story. It's enabled us.
Totally. Yeah.
So the press, your predecessors, played an enormously important role. They were in some ways, the Ida B. Wells compatriots of the day. She was obviously reporting on lynching and bringing that to light, but the Baltimore Afro was reporting on what was happening at the facility and in other places. So I reference that because one of the early stories, which I think both the Afro and another Black press reported on, included a report where a child's family came to visit. They were told that their child had run away, but a young man who was interviewed years later, who I think was in his 30s or 40s, but had been there back then, said, "I knew that wasn't true because we had buried that boy the night before." Right?
Yeah.
So let that sink in for a moment. Not only were families not being told that a child had died, they were being lied to. And that gentleman, when he was a child, the kids were burying their peers. The children were forced to take one of their friends across the road. We don't know anything about that at this point. Was there ceremony? Was there tribute? Was there anything? How did that boy die? The death certificates that we've uncovered almost exclusively refer to the cause of death as some type of disease, whether that's tuberculosis or related types of diseases, meningitis. But what we also know, you heard some of that reporting on the webinar where we launched the initiative, is that there was very serious abuse and neglect that led to deaths.
Yeah.
The child who was forced to be in a unheated room for 10 days, who got frostbite and gangrene, who had to have his feet amputated and died as a result of that surgery. on the death certificate, it says gangrene, right?
Yeah. Doesn't exactly tell you how he got gangrene in that situation. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, I can't remember how we got to this, but that is what we're seeing in terms of deaths in custody back then. Was there a protocol? The way it was handled? No.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
Have you uncovered any evidence that, so if my memory serves here, you guys have identified at least like 230 kids who are buried or were buried back there in the grave site.
Can I take a half step back,
John?
Yeah,
good.
Because what I didn't tell you, what I haven't shared is how we discovered that there were boys buried out there.
Yeah, let's go with that next. Yeah.
Before we get, and this relates to the numbers.
Sure.
So as we were doing the research, right, and with Crystal leading the effort, creating drafts of a report, sharing them with myself, with Vinny, with others in the leadership, one day I got a call from Nick Maroney. Nick was the longtime juvenile justice monitor in Maryland, who did an excellent job, in my view, monitoring the conditions. He worked for the Attorney General's office, a real advocate and champion for children. One day, Nick called me and said, Mark, I understand you guys are doing research and some type of project into the history of the Cheltenham facility. And I said, yeah, that's accurate, Nick. We want to do all the facilities and the agency and the system, but we've started with Cheltenham. And he said, great. He said, there's a gentleman named Claude Waters who had retired from DJS a few years before, I think in 2018, so about 5 years before. And Nick said Claude had worked at the facility for about 40 years and holds himself out as a local historian for Cheltenham. And he said, do you want to talk to Claude? And I said, absolutely, I want to talk to Claude. Yes. And he said, great, I'll connect the two of you. So he connected us. I reached out to Claude by email, and he responded very enthusiastically about wanting to meet and share what he knew. And we agreed to meet out at the old facility, which had closed in 2016, I think. And I was familiar with the old facility. In fact, I had an office in one of the old buildings out there. And so we agreed to meet out there. And so I said to Crystal, there's this gentleman I've been introduced to. We'll head out there. And I reached out to my former colleague, Tyrone Walker, who I had worked with at JPI. And the reason I reached out to Tyrone is I knew two things. One, he had an interest in this historical research. He was working for and does work for Georgetown currently, the Prisons and Justice Initiative. But I also knew that Tyrone had been incarcerated at Cheltenham as a child. And this was July of 2024, July 18th, 2024. And so myself, Crystal, Tyrone went out to the Cheltenham facility and we met Mr. Waters. And he walked us through the old facility, gave us a tour. We walked through the unit that Tyrone had been incarcerated in back in the 90s, which was a very powerful moment. And at the end of the walkthrough, we were standing by the gate to leave. And Mr. Waters turned to me and he said, Mr. Schindler, back in the day, a long time ago, there were children who died in the old facility. I don't think he was sharing the dates. I don't think he said the House of Reformation, but I can't remember. And he said they were buried on land across the road. And I've seen 4 or 5 of the gravestones out there. Do you want to see them? That was the first I had ever heard. I knew about the name of the place. That was the first I had ever heard that there were children who died there and were buried nearby.
Was your assumption at that point that when a child died at the House of Reformation, they were sent back to their family?
To be honest, John, I hadn't thought about
Yeah.
that. What
happens?
No, I hadn't even thought if children had died there. I just didn't know. Yeah. Right. So it's not it hadn't entered my mind. Maybe shame on me, but I hadn't thought about it. And I'll come back to that. So we said to Claude, absolutely. Yeah, I want to go see this. And so he said, okay. He said, it's on a different piece of property. It's in the back of what is currently a cemetery for veterans. Right. So we got in our cars, we drove around, we went into the cemetery for veterans in the front, and we drove to the back, right, beyond where the nice manicured area for deceased veterans. And we walked into the woods, and we followed Claude into a very heavily, thickly wooded area, and we started to look. And we were there that day, I would say, for about 90 minutes or so. And we couldn't find any gravestones. And this was, think about I don't think he had been there in some years, and it's very thickly heavy wood, large area.
Yeah.
He said, I think it might be over in this area, but it might have been further over there. And we covered a pretty large area, but we couldn't find it. But he said, I know, I've seen them. There are 4 to 5 gravestones here. And so we said, okay, I said, we'll have to come back another time and look. We can try to figure out how to do this where we can find them. And we left. Crystal continued to do her research. She came across documentation referencing that there was a cemetery for boys. It was referred to as the Boys Village Cemetery, even though that wasn't the name of the facility at the time. It had subsequently been called Boys Village. And she found documents because that area of land had actually been surveyed through the Maryland Historical Trust for a number of different reasons, including there was some efforts years ago to possibly designate the area as a historical site. And as part of the surveying, there were aerial maps of the woods that showed where the gravestones were. So we got those maps. We went back in October of 2024, actually, just coincidentally, October 31st. So we went back looking for the lost cemetery on Halloween.
Creepy. Just the Halloween part.
Wasn't really thinking about it at the time, but yeah. And so it was myself, Crystal, Tyrone. Mr. Waters couldn't be there that day. He has taken ill, sadly. I don't know if we'll find anything that day. We didn't find anything the first time, but at least now we had a map. And so we went into the woods. We also had our communications director, Mike Sharp, and we started looking. A couple of the maintenance guys from the Veterans Cemetery came along and said, what are you doing? What are you looking for? Who are you people out in the woods? And I explained who we were, and they proceeded to help. One guy ran and got a leaf blower, and we started looking. And it actually didn't take that long that we found, I think that day, 4 gravestones. These gravestones were known about by the Maryland Historical Trust. They were photographs.
I wanted to just pause on that for a second. So am I understanding you right that there was at some point the idea of making this a historical site to honor that it was a cemetery for boys? And who led that? That seems interesting that there was, before you guys and your initiative, there, like somebody thought of this a while back.
Not only that, no, it is designated.
Oh,
so
it was successful.
It depends on how you define successful. There were, as best I know, I'd have to go back and look, and we're documenting this. There were 2 efforts to do that. And the Washington Post actually has documented this with their excellent investigative journalism. Katie Metler and Michael Bryce Sadler, 2 amazing reporters who worked on this story and continue to work on it. There were a couple of efforts. One that was successful was that the Prince George's County Planning Commission at one point I think it was in the 80s. The first survey was done in the 80s, and they knew about it. And it was part of a larger survey where they were trying to designate historic sites in the county, not for the National Historic Register. It was a county level process. And they had, as I understand it, they had identified about 80 to 100 sites around the county that they believe should be designated as historic sites. And that went before the Prince George's County Council, voted on it, and these sites were designated as historic sites in the county. The Boys Village Cemetery was on that list. Didn't get any attention. It wasn't the only place. It was one of, and I'm sitting here thinking I should go look at the list. I haven't seen the list, but it had a whole bunch of other places, right? So it was known about. And there was another surveying that took place. To make it, I think, even in some ways more disturbing, and the Washington Post, again, as part of their reporting, uncovered this. In the 1970s, I think it was 72 or 74, Maryland was the first state to establish a state agency, as I understand it, to create an agency for military veterans in the state and to create a cemetery for people who had fought who were Maryland residents. Maryland was the first state to do that. I had never really thought about whether there were state cemeteries for veterans. Maryland, as I understand it, was the first, and now every state has one, but Maryland was the first. For whatever reason, I don't know the history behind that. When that agency was created with the charge of establishing the cemeteries for veterans, they were looking for land. They identified the land adjacent to what was then the it wasn't Juvenile Services predecessor. And that land, which wasn't being used by the department, was deeded to this new agency. What the Washington Post found is in that deed, there was reference to the Boys Village Cemetery. So state officials knew that back there in that plot of woods, there were boys buried. I don't know if they knew how many. They did, as best we can tell, nothing. Now, the only thing they didn't do, which would have been worse, is they didn't wipe it out and toss those bones and use it for their own. So they didn't do that. I don't know if that was intentional or not. But when I think about how outrageous that was, that state officials knew that there were children buried back in those woods and they did nothing, I think that is horrible. I think it's another level of outrage. That state agency, it wasn't like that was like the Department of Transportation or some other agency that dealt with whatever, general services. It was an agency created to create and maintain cemeteries. That's what these people did.
That's crazy.
And they did a good job. There is a very nice, well-maintained, dignified cemetery for veterans. They should have a cemetery, right, where people can visit. But those people who were charged with creating a nice, dignified, well-maintained cemetery, they just left those kids back in the woods. So when we were there on October 31st, we found those 4 headstones. But then, and I don't think Claude Waters knew about this. I haven't had the chance to talk with him since then. I've reached out many times, but I think he's taken quite ill. We then walked to what was on the maps, the second section, which again, I don't think he knew about. And that's where we found the cinder blocks, rows upon rows of cinder blocks, counting at least about 100. So it wasn't just 4, which would have been bad enough. It was over 100 We now believe that the numbers are somewhere between 230, maybe as high as 300.
So have you guys unearthed any evidence of whether or not attempts were ever made to tell families about these between 200 and 300 children? Or to the best of your knowledge, it was just never communicated to any of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think at this point, we know just a tiny bit. And actually, we know more this week than we did last week. And I think that's going to be the way this sort of initiative evolves. So up until this week, the only thing I knew about that was the story I related to you, right? Where
Yeah.
it was reported that a family came and not only were they not told, they were lied to.
Yeah.
We don't have any evidence, documentation about notification of families or not prior to that. We are now in the process at the initiative, and this can be a segue to further conversation, of doing the rigorous genealogical research to try to identify living relatives of the 230 or so boys, as many as we can identify and locate. We believe, identified living relatives for 8 of the boys who were buried. And that's out of doing research only on 12 or 13. So our success rate so far is pretty high. We've started with the boys who were most recently buried. So that's in the 1930s, 1920s versus 1870s, because we think the kids from the 1870s, that will probably be harder in terms of what documents exist. We've started doing that outreach. We have had communication just this week with family members of 2 different boys who died or were killed and are buried. One of the family members was aware that a relative, it was a cousin, had gone to the House of Reformation, and they believed, their understanding up to this day is that that child had been killed. That's the belief that they had for the last 100 or so years, even though the death certificate lists tuberculosis. In fact, that gentleman shared with us that as he was growing up, he was admonished by an older family member, behave yourself. You don't want to end up, right? Who never came home. Another family member who we've talked to for a different child had no knowledge at all that they were related even to a child. I don't know. We'll have to do more research. There may have been other parts of the family who had some knowledge, but this is something that we're working on. And we believe it's so important for families to know the truth, right, about what happened to children in their family who were in state custody, the way they were treated, both in life and in death, and to be able to be afforded some dignity, to have their family members treated with the humanity and dignity that they didn't receive, as best we know, and have a voice about what should happen with their long-lost family members. This is similar to the process that played out in Florida around the boys buried at the Dozier School, where they did exhume bodies, conducted DNA analysis, did very rigorous forensic research. I don't know whether that'll happen in Maryland. We'll have to see.
So I imagine as you guys continue to do this work and this research that you're already thinking about the outcome here. And I would guess that kind of breaks down into 2 different buckets, if you will. One, how these kids who died 100 years ago or more are going to be remembered, what's going to be done to honor them, if anything. And then The other is how do we take any lessons from this experience that you guys are researching and surfacing and apply it to modern day challenges, policy asks in youth justice. So why don't you take the first part first and tell us what's on your mind as you think about how Maryland and other places who have experienced similar things can honor kids who've died on these campuses.
Yeah, that's a great question, John. And it's really amazing, I think, and I think unfortunate. So the field, if you will, we've really been put on notice in many ways since the Dozier situation came to light nationally, and particularly since it came to light since the publication of Nickel Boys and since the film has been out. And I'm not sure why. I can just speak for myself, why I didn't think more about whether there were other Doziers out there. I think part of it is we're so busy as a field trying to fix what's going on currently and look forward that we don't do a good a job as to look backwards. And so when it came to light in Maryland, which we were not expecting, that we had a situation that seemed quite similar to what happened at Dozier. Vinny and I sat down and we talked with our leadership team and talked about what should we do. And so we started to talk to people, particularly the folks who were involved with the Dozier investigation, to think about, okay, what's the path forward? How do we appropriately recognize these young people? Make sure that we know their name, because we knew that if we could do the appropriate research, which we are now doing at the Forgotten Children Initiative, that there are families out there of these young people. That was clear in Dozier, and they were actively involved. It's been less the case so far in Maryland, partly because the children who were deceased is further back than the most recent kids in Florida.
Right.
And so what is appropriate in terms of making sure that we as a field, as a country, know that this happened in places around the country, similar to the way people know what happened with indigenous children in native boarding schools, similar to the way I think we as a country and many people struggle with what happened in the large mental institutions where there often are cemeteries or burial grounds. But we as a field in the juvenile justice community and in the child welfare community, and I want to make sure we talk about both those together, because I think as we talked about, these kids were as much child welfare kids as they were juvenile justice kids. They were, in many ways, the first crossover. But we as a field need to make sure that the stories of these children are told, that they're appropriately honored, memorialized, and as important, that their families, their living family members, are also able to know this information, and then to have them guide us. I don't think these are decisions that should solely be made by the government, nor do I think they are decisions that should be made by someone like me. I think we should be working together with families and communities, particularly the families of the children, as best we can identify them. And as I said, we started to do that. And the communities from which those children came, to make decisions about how the children can be most appropriately recognized, given the dignity in death that they did not have in life or death. So I think it's going to be a process. But I think most importantly, also recognizing that the past is not just the past, it is the present, and is how we look forward.
And so how do we do that? It strikes me as a fine line. Obviously, it's a fundamentally different world now. It's completely possible that there are questionable or challenging conditions we want to change about youth justice without it being one of those cases where it's like everything then is true today, which nobody would believe really as a public selling point. So where do you see the lessons you're learning from this apply to the modern day system and what you think needs to change there?
Yeah, I think there are 2 points that I would make on that, and it's a good question. One is there are clear through lines. And the through lines that we see most evident is we are talking about the same children and communities, disproportionately children of color, particularly African American youth, and disproportionately poor children. And so the same communities, the same children that were being impacted 100, 150 years ago are the same kids that we're seeing today. And I think it's important that we understand that the foundation upon which the children's legal system and adult system was built was foundations based on slavery and racialized policies. We've known that for some time, but I don't think the link has been made as strong as it should be. I think that potentially brings other people to the table and to the conversation as we wrestle with these issues. So that's one way. The other way is to look particularly at the policies and practices that are going on today. And we need to take action as well and honor children. These are legacies that these children left, I think. And so I, for one, feel like the voices, for example, of the children who laid in unmarked graves in Prince George's County, we owe them to make this right and to do better, because it clearly didn't happen for them. So I think understanding our history, understanding the through lines, making sure that we are acting as a way that honors the legacy of the children who lost their lives and the families who are still impacted by these systems, hopefully will motivate us even more to do the work. And then lastly, like so much of what we do, these are human rights issues, right? This is about accountability. This is about knowing what the data shows, right? We didn't know this data recently, right? Now I'm seeing there's probably close to 1,000 children, probably more, who are buried around the country. I think without knowing that information, it's hard to act on that information. And that's true throughout the system. If we don't know the data, if we don't know how it's impacting children systemically, it's very difficult to act. And then I think lastly, always being reminded, these are children. And these are somebody's sons, daughters, cousins, grandchildren. And so that's a reminder, I think, that all of us in the system have to keep at the front of our minds that these are children. And they were children 100 and 150 years ago. And the children sitting in detention centers around the country today, the same. But I think we sometimes forget that. And clearly society pushes to not take that on and not value the children who are sitting at detention centers as much as we might. And they should be children throughout the rest of our communities.
Well said. Marc Schindler, Center for Youth Justice at Georgetown. It's the Forgotten Children's Initiative. We will drop a link in the show notes for anybody who wants to read up a little more on what they're up to there. But Marc, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thanks, John. Pleasure to be with you, and appreciate the work that you do and have done for so long in the field.
Thanks to Marc Schindler of Georgetown's Center for Youth Justice for joining us today to discuss the Forgotten Children's Initiative. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories of child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly. We'll see you next week.